Welcome to the Cascades Expo. Give me 1 second. We'll have Danielle being our first speaker. She's a lawyer at BCF and one of the early supporters of the POTS program, which I'm sure you'll get to learn quite a lot about through Tamara's booth.
It's a great program.
Yeah. And I won't get in the way of the wonderful talk, so go ahead.
Thanks, Alex. As Alex said, my name's Danielle Olofsson. I'm a chief privacy officer for my law firm. I work at BCF. I'm a lawyer. What can I say? I think this is such an important program. I really wish this program had been around when I was a student a long time ago, because it's so very important. When I was preparing the talk that I'm giving now, I further realized how important what this program is and what you're doing is, because without you and without this program, we're not going anywhere, at least legally speaking. So this talk is called Getting Data Protection Right. It's not easy. I will not yap on for an hour because I'm fighting a flu bug, but please ask any questions that you have. I'd be more than happy to answer them. I'm going to start with 3 stories. They're loosely connected because they're linked to data and the use of data. The first story, which is a true story. Imagine this: you're sitting in your living room, you're gaming, you're playing a video game, and you've got a headgear. You don't know that the headgear is connected to you know that it's connected, but you don't know all of the people to whom it's connected. Turns out it's connected to law enforcement. Lo and behold, policemen knock at your door and arrest you. The headgear has told somebody in the law enforcement that you, who thought you were shooting zombies, were in fact shooting your classmates. For a brief minute, the headgear that is able to sort of monitor brain waves and brain activity has indicated to law enforcement that you're no longer shooting zombies, you're shooting your fellow classmates. This actually happened. The individual charges weren't pressed because no crime had been committed, but the individual was forced to change high schools. It's pretty severe. Example number 2. You're an avid photographer. You download an app that is supposed to help improve your photographs. You notice after a couple of weeks that your best friend's pictures of your best friend rather, never appear among the pictures that are kept by this app. This app works because it deletes by deleting photos that it does not think are perfect or that it does not think are good photos. It deletes them automatically and keeps only your good photos. What you realize is that the way that this app is reading your photos is that your best friend, has a physiognomy where, according to the app, she's squinting. This happened as well. Can you imagine the PR nightmare that this caused? App was pulled off the market. Third horror story. This also happened. This was in Toronto that this happened. You're a medical clinic, and you're getting rid of your medical records, as you have to do. You're cleaning up your medical records, the old medical records. You're sending them off to a document management system to be destroyed the way that they're supposed to be destroyed. You're walking into work one day. The block has been turned into a set for a 9/11 movie. You look down, pick up one of the papers that's on the ground. It's one of the medical records. Medical records weren't destroyed, they were sold to a props company and used as part of the paraphernalia that was supposed to be scattered in the streets post 9/11. These are horror stories, causing a lot of problems, obviously, for the companies that have gone through them. There are also examples that are just very loosely tied together by the fact that they involve data. They illustrate some of the fantastic things that can be done. If you think of this headset example, yeah, the example of the individual being arrested because the headset seemed to suggest that there was a distinction that wasn't being drawn between his classmates and the zombies that he was supposed to be shooting. This is also headgear that's used on certain large train routes in order to monitor the conductor's activity. Is the person falling asleep? Are they as alert as you want them to be? So there is a safety function that can be fulfilled with the same technology. But they can also go horribly wrong. And hence the title of this talk, Getting Data Protection Policies Right. It's not easy. And it's not easy for many reasons. Some of the most obvious are, first, it's a very new field. 20 years ago, you'd never think of talking about data protection the way we do now. Obviously, we didn't have the vast amounts of data 20 years ago. We didn't have the ability to generate that kind of data 20 years ago, as we do now. But we just weren't thinking about it. So in terms of time frame, it is a relatively new phenomenon. Also, there's a lot of regulation that's being thrown at data protection. And it's being thrown at data protection sometimes in a thought out, but mostly in a very unthought out way. Europe passed very extensive data protection legislation almost 2 years ago. And countries have scrambled to try and meet the criterion that this European data protection legislation requires without necessarily adapting it to their reality, to their needs. And so there's a frenzy right now around this kind of thing. And then third, there's technology. This is where you come in. The technology is just pushing back and saying, okay, fine, these are your regulations, but you know what? It doesn't work that way. So you can regulate as much as you want, but we just don't work that way. And that is the second part of my talk, and that is where this program becomes so important. It becomes so important to have people who know how data works to be able to inform policymakers and legislators. Otherwise, we're just going to stay in the mess that we're in, and we are in a mess right now. So I've divided the presentation into two parts. The first part, I'm going to run over this quickly because it's pretty dry, is the state of data protection legislation today. And the second part is just a questioning whether the way that we've approached data protection is realistic given the technology, given our practices also involving data. Our legislation is 20 years old at best, sometimes more than 20 years old, and it's based on a whole bunch of assumptions that just aren't here. We don't use data that way anymore. Data's become also its own beast. So, what is the state of the law with respect to data protection? Right now, the law, regardless of whether you are in America, Europe, Asia, protects what we call personal information. And we've defined personal information in a very broad way to include any information that alone or in combination can be used to identify someone. That includes cookies, that includes IP addresses, be they static or dynamic. Anything that you can use in combination with someone else to identify someone can be considered personal information, unless you can anonymize the information. And we all know that that's a next to impossible process at this point in time, notably because of disconnect between the scientists and the policymakers. We just don't understand each other. So we've said, okay, if you can anonymize it, but we all know you can't anonymize data. It is so easy to re-identify it, to re-attribute data. So that's a bit of a wish. But the minute an organization, deals with personal information, it has to do so according to 10 principles. In Canada, we call these the Canadian Standard Association principles, but they're largely the same as the principles that exist in Europe, OECD, or in Asia. And this is what is also challenging with data protection legislation, is that it is so integrated. It is impossible for one country to go off and say, hey, we're going to do things this way because the rest of the world is doing it another way, and data is flowing across borders. So you can't just go rogue. You have to figure out how to work within a larger set of things, which is in one sense reassuring because you will always have the same reactions, you'll always have the same red flags, but it's a challenge also to adapt these general principles to your specific reality. So what I'll do is I'll discuss the principles quickly. The first one is accountability. If you deal in any way as an organization with personal information, you must be accountable. What that means is you are ultimately responsible. I collect your data, I screw up, I lose it, I have a breach, I'm the one who's responsible. I need to compensate you, I need to make it better for you. So if I collect data, I'm accountable. The next thing that's really important is what we call identifying purpose. We have to identify the purpose for which we collect data. This becomes interesting, second part of the talk, when we talk about artificial intelligence. How are you supposed to identify the purpose of an algorithm before you can even know what an algorithm is going to do? So, but it's a very important principle of data protection. I know you must identify the purpose for which you are collecting or using data. Consent. I must go and get the person's consent if I'm using their data. Limiting collection. I must limit my collection to the purpose that I've identified. I can't go and collect more information than is absolutely necessary to fulfill the purpose that I've identified. And it doesn't matter whether I've asked a person for their consent. If I'm collecting too much information, I can't do that even with the person's consent. So that's another one that's really important. I have to limit the use, the disclosure, and the retention I make of data. I cannot keep information forever. I cannot keep personal information forever. I cannot keep data forever. I must ensure that my data is accurate. I must put in place safeguards. I have to be open, which means that I need to provide you with a policy. If I'm going to collect your data, you need to know what I'm going to be doing with your data. I can't just collect it and not be transparent about what I'm going to be doing with your data. I have to give you access to your data, and I also have to give you a complaint procedure to follow if you're unhappy with the way that I'm handling your data. So these are all of the responsibilities that are incumbent on an organization that collects personal information. Not all organizations necessarily adhere to these in the same way. The sector in which you operate will determine how you, where you place yourself with respect to these principles. What I mean by that is, if you're a private sector organization, one of the most important principles here is going to be consent. You're going to want to get consent for the information that you collect. Consent is not necessarily a realistic concept in the public sector. We need stats for our the censuses. We need to be able to use information. We need to be able to have information in the public sector. And so it's not realistic necessarily to focus on consent so much. So what the public sector does is say, okay, we're not going to privilege consent, but we will privilege access. You will always have access to the information that we collect on you. We will always tell you what we're collecting. If we are not able to give you access, then we must keep special lists. They must be approved by Parliament. So there's a whole system put in place to protect your information in the public sector if you're not giving your consent. In medical sector, things are slightly different as well. There's no need for consent among the circle of care, so that means your doctor, your nurse, but outside of that, you can't just be flipping information back and forth. I can't use your information to train my staff. And that's something that happens a lot. We don't think, we haven't anonymized the information. We're using patient information to train our staff. You can't do that. That's personal information. And nobody's allowed you to do that. No one's given their consent to do that. So depending on what sector you're in, you're going to be leveraging these principles a little differently. So while the Canadian system may look demanding, it's nowhere as demanding as the European system, which gives individuals a right to forget, which means that I don't like what Google has posted on me. I can go to Google and say, listen, I want that business taken down. Google has to take down the information that it keeps on you. There are a number of rights like this that have not come to Canada yet, although there's some discussion that they might. But these are very present in Europe, and there have been several cases that have been tried on these, and the individual has won on these cases. California is another jurisdiction that is putting in place, that has consistently sort of led the pack in data protection. It may be because of the large Silicon Valley. Some people cynically say that it's because it's going to enable what we call in French the GAFAM, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook. It's going to enable them to keep a market share because they have the infrastructure to put in place the large data protection, the data protection infrastructure that you need within an organization. Because they can do that, that gives them an edge because it's blocking out any new entrants. If you're a new entrant, you don't have $50,000 to throw at a privacy program. You just don't. You're a startup. You barely have any. You don't have any money at all. So there's. It's interesting how this legislation is being leveraged from a competition level. Pardon me. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn now to the second part of this presentation, and that is I'd like to just talk loosely, and I have no answers at all, and I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say. But there are three areas that I've sort of singled out that are causing a tremendous challenge, I think, to the way that we protect data. The first one, and probably the most obvious, is artificial intelligence. I was at a conference in late October this year, or last year, and we were listening. It was a Canadian Bar Association conference, and we were listening to an expert from the Department of Justice on artificial intelligence tell us that the legislation was perfectly adapted for artificial intelligence. I mean, there wasn't a person in the room who wasn't rolling their eyes. And we were all just completely, the conference was in Ottawa, and this person said, everybody was completely astounded. We are not adapted by any stretch of the imagination to the challenges posed by artificial intelligence. If you look at some of the principles, limiting collection, AI works on an over collection of information. It has to have all of that data. If it doesn't have that data, it can't generate what we want it to generate. And by the way, we don't know what we want it to generate before we start. So how on earth are we supposed to identify the purpose for which we've used a particular algorithm? It just flies in the face of data protection principles right now. And I don't know, I have clients who come in this area of AI, and they say, well, what do we do? How do we manage this? We don't have any I don't have an answer other than try and design as best you can, knowing that you have these privacy requirements. But so artificial intelligence is one area. Another area that's really important is the whole area of and it's sideline of AI, but just algorithmic bias. The example at the beginning of this talk about the app that's deleting your friends' images because of their physiognomy. This is by no way an exception. There are apps that, this is another horror story. You signed up, it was a gay dating site, and you'd sign up for the gay dating site, And lo and behold, the people who had signed up started to get information on pedophilia. How on earth you would make that link is beyond me. It's offensive, but it happened. And so people had to look at, but what is the bias is my point. What is the bias that is feeding these kinds of correlations? Now, in France, one way the European Union has dealt with this is said, look, we're not going to force individuals to be subject to decisions made by algorithms. Okay, that's one way of dealing with it, but you're not dealing really with the problem. You're not dealing with the whole issue of bias. You're not dealing, and we don't know how to deal with it because the legislatures don't know anything about the data science. They don't know anything about the ground, the substance behind this. And this is why this program that you're preaching for is so important. You've got to get in at your level, at ground zero, and understand this stuff so that you'll be able to inform legislatures. You'll be able to make the policies that are real and that are meaningful. The third area this is just recently, this has come up, is the whole idea of an integrated approach to data protection. Canada has an integrated approach to data protection. So does Europe. What I mean by that is that we just say, okay, here's our data protection legislation. We will protect. We protect data, be it private, public. It doesn't matter which sector. The United States, for a long time, and still does this, has adopted a sectoral approach to data protection, saying, okay, look, data in financial reporting, data in insurance, data in healthcare, data in child online activity. These are certain hot sectors where it's hard, where data is extremely sensitive. And so they've legislated in those areas and said, okay, in these areas, there are going to be very tight data protection requirements imposed on companies who operate in these sectors. But they haven't got an integrated data protection legislation. And for the longest time I thought, that makes no sense at all. And now I'm beginning to think that it makes a tremendous amount of sense to approach things the way that the United States does. And the reason for that is the following. Increasingly, well, we've noticed that when people fill out their profiles online, do you actually tell the truth? Do you actually give them your real name, address, age, or do you lie? And I don't mean lie, I'm not judging that. Or do you try and protect yourself by giving false information? The French Data Protection Authority last week issued a newsletter advising people to give wrong information when they sign up for connected toys and connected things. So, I mean, it's something that irritates Zuckerberg to no end, but the point is people are doing it. People have taken their privacy into their own hands and have said, okay, you know what, I'm not giving you my real information. And marketing companies, ironically, have noticed in the last 4 or 5 years that they are not able to get the audiences that they thought, to target the audiences they thought they could target. Why? Because your information's wrong, boys. And this was something that was really interesting last year. One of the findings that absolutely floored me in the PODS program was I think there were 10 different projects, and all of them spent 80% of their time cleaning up data before they could actually get to what the project wanted to do. So my question here is, why are we protecting dirty data? Why are we protecting data despite the fact that it may not be it may not be linked to the person, this may not be this person's identity? Why are we protecting all sorts of data willy-nilly when there are absolutely pieces of data that are sensitive, that are linked to your identity? Biometrics, you can't change that. Your voice, your image. These aren't things that you can change, but you can change your phone number, you can change your address. Are those necessarily worthy of the same kind of protection? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But it's certainly, I think, an avenue that's worth exploring. So these are just some examples, I think, of the disconnect between law and this particular field of, law and data protection in the field of technology and innovation. So to conclude, getting data protection right is not easy. It's not easy in and of itself because the subject is baroque. But more importantly, it's not easy because of the tremendous disconnect between the legislator and the reality of the data that we are trying to protect and our practices with respect to data that evolve and change. But I think it's only by getting a multidisciplinary team of data scientists involved in policy making that this is going to have any hope of changing, which is why I'm throwing it over to you. This is your responsibility now. This is a great program, the Cascades program and the PODS programs. And it's because of people like you that this kind of stuff will get fixed. So thank you. And please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate.
What advice would you have to, I guess, like young people who are studying data science to get involved in policy? Like what kind of, like other than pods, like you said, I'm a first or master's student, so I'm not eligible, but I'm really interested in getting into policy, like an internship or after I finish my degree.
I think that you need to start writing, get out there, blogging, become known as an expert. You'd be surprised how fast you can become an expert, especially in topics. We're old, we don't know anything. And so the minute that we can get our hands on some fresh blood who can explain stuff to us, it's great. So don't underestimate the power that you have because you're young, because you know this stuff. Don't hesitate to elbow your way in, because that's what we need. Is that helpful or not? I know that Derek and Nick are very adamant about getting people involved. Another one who is really, really helpful is Chris Regan. If you can get to speak to Chris is phenomenally open. And we'll get you in front of the people you need to get in front of.
There are rumors that Canada is going to introduce a similar data protection act to GDPR. Do you think it's going to just replicate GDPR, or is it going to try and be a bit more focused?
I wish that rumor were true. Canada's tricky because its whole structure right now is so far from the GDPR, and Canada has to at least comply with certain requirements of the GDPR because this is just it's a technicality. If you want to trade the European country, or you want to trade data with a European company in Europe, you have to either be GDPR compliant, which is a real swine, it's really expensive, or you have to come from a country that is deemed to be adequate, which means a country that is deemed to have a privacy structure comparable to Europe's. Canada does have an adequacy status right now, which means that Canadian companies have been able to fly sort of under the radar because of this adequacy status. The difficulty is the status is under review right now, and we are nowhere near adequate. I don't know what the government will come out with. Anything that I've seen has been discouraging because they just don't understand. They don't seem to understand the importance of this. And what's really scary too is you can have a free trade agreement with Europe, but if your data protection legislation isn't in place, that can be used to cut trade between the two countries. So they do have to recognize something like the right to forget. They'll have to recognize many of the rights that the GDPR has created. Our biggest problem, though, is our structures. We have an ombudsman structure federally. So our privacy commissioner cannot even punish companies that are offside. What it can do is make recommendations. And an illustration of how egregious this is that in 2009, the Commission had made recommendations to Facebook that were exactly the same that it made this year in its report to Facebook following the Cambridge Analytica scandals. Facebook just said, you have no enforcement mechanism, so we're not going to listen to you. But that's how shocking it is. Now that is not the case in Alberta, it's not the case in British Columbia, and it's not the case in Quebec. Those three provinces have their own privacy structure and privacy legislation. Alberta and British Columbia, I think, are way ahead of the game. Quebec, unfortunately, was the first province to pass the legislation in '93 and has done nothing since, which is really, really sad. No, that's fine. So long answer, I hope, but we have a long way to go. The white paper recommendation that I read in the fall wasn't there yet. But the government has said they're going to turn their hand to it now. Will help.
I was wondering if you had any opinions on the idea that we may be able to regulate big data or public data as a public good?
I hope so, and this is something that actually I'm working on right now, and I think it's extremely exciting. The whole idea of a data commons or a data trust, those are phenomenal. What I mean by that is that there's the Sidewalk Labs example in Toronto, but what it is we realize that the different actors need access to the same data. So, you may have insurance companies that need access to the same data that your medical, that your hospital will need or your doctor will need. And there may be not, NGOs that need access to the same information. So what a data trust would do would enable individuals to say, okay, I'll allow you to have access to my data, but based on a very clear structure of what my data is going to be used for. And then these other actors would be able to come and use it. They're just legally speaking, I was trying to research this to figure out actually how to structure one. And in England, they're having trouble because data is not considered the kind of property that can be transferred into a trust, which I think is ludicrous. In Quebec, that I don't think is the same, although I'm debating that right now. And the other thing is that a trust has to be for particular beneficiaries, and a purpose trust is a really tricky thing to work out in the English system. Not so in Quebec. Quebec has a trust that would be able to allow for that. But if you don't use a trust, you can also use a corporate structure or other structures. The idea, and I think it's great, and it's an idea that's being played with a lot in the health system. The English health system especially is way ahead of the pack on trying to figure out how are we going to pool information, how are we going to have access to this information. Because some of the big data prevents a whole lot of very intrusive testing on animals, there's huge advantages to using big data in order to do research, and we've found cures for things that we would normally not have been able to find cures for just using data, so using sort of big data. So there's definitely an argument to be made, and I hope we can come up with something. It's just legally the structure right now is unclear. They don't know how to do it, but that's silly. That we can fix. Other questions? Yeah.
I was drawn to what you said about the lack of an enforcement mechanism for protection and recognizing the rights of the GDPR.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, what you said about the GAFAM and having the infrastructure for data protection, that's more of like a private sector thing. But how can we bridge that disconnect between the big companies that have the infrastructure to protect their data and the enforcement mechanisms? Because I think those are two very conflicting.
It's an incredible problem, and people are howling in Europe right now. The small companies, startups are howling here. California passed a law which recognized that and basically said, okay, if you're, I think it's under $25 million of revenue, this law doesn't apply unless 50% of your revenue is generated from collection of big data, which I think is fair. If you're going to play in that field, then get with it. But if you're not going to play with that in that field, why on earth would you have to be subject to this legislation? So yes, and there's no answer to that right now because we're realizing, whoa, this is being used as it's basically being used as an anti-competitive mechanism. You can't enter the market. And so there's a lot of discussion about that. Yeah.
Is there any policy proposals at all around like the use, research, and potential sale of publicly available data, like social media data, especially in light of the scandal?
What you're saying is interesting because our laws in Canada are so dated, that's actually considered personal information. In Europe, it's not. If you publish something, social media, you're fine. If you want to use it, it's fine. In Canada, it's considered personal information. The difficulty, I think the smart answer to your question, I will stop showing off. The smart answer to your question is that when you take information from social media and you use it for a different end, what you're doing is you're repurposing that information, and technically you need to have a person's consent in order to use their information in a different way. Now, where your point is extremely valid is that we've come up with this just recently with registers. What do you do with registers? There's a whole sort of subgroup of companies that make money by going through public registries and selling that information. One of the models that I can think of is, what are they going through? They're going through bankruptcy registries and other sort of property registries, selling this information, who was it to realtors, to show that if you buy in a certain area, you're less likely to have deadbeat neighbors who, are not bankrupt, and this is just, to me, a complete misuse of this data. But there's nothing hard and fast saying you can't do it. So it's an extremely interesting and extremely topical question, and we haven't got an answer to it yet.
Following on your point, I don't know if you heard this, but there's a company called Clearview AI, and they just launched a facial recognition AI. What basically it does is it takes all the public photos that you posted by yourself or like the YouTube videos that are public and uses those as surveillance. And it sells it to like office departments, which are being tried in Canada as well. It has been banned in European Union.
I can imagine.
But in Canada, it is being tried as well as in many more states in the US.
Well, this is, the disconnect between Europe and Canada. We don't have legislation there. But to me, I'm highly offensive.
Yeah, my question was, under what circumstances this violates data privacy in Canada?
What is the model exactly?
It basically takes all the photos that you uploaded or public, and it takes it, and then they sell it to office departments, and when they try and upload a photo of you, like when they're trying to find you, it just basically looks everywhere that you posted. Like last time you posted something on YouTube, you've seen here in this camera, and it takes that and basically gives you the address and time that you were last seen.
I think that would actually come into our, there would, I think a strong argument could be made that is offside Canadian data protection legislation because that's personal information and the person is not given a consent to it. It's personal information because of a glitch in our law that basically says only information appearing in newspapers and magazines are considered public information. Otherwise, it's private information, and I think it would fall under that.
And it's just repurposing it.
Yeah, and it's repurposing the information. You're welcome. Yeah.
What about like treating your data as an individual, right? For example, like I wouldn't want my medical data to be used, like supposedly, I don't want my medical data to be used to train a machine learning model for hospitals. How can you like enforce that, like as an individual, right?
They have no right to take that information, period. But who knows whether they do, but it's a huge problem in hospitals and people are very aware of it. And so a hospital would be really foolhardy to try that these days.
I don't think that in the UK,
Pardon me?
I know like for example like in the UK there has been like companies to use AI and machine learning in like hospital settings and to train those like machine learning models to pull all data and data.
I know in the UK they have a different approach to health information. It's protected obviously, but there's there's a greater ability to share it. Pardon me. I'm sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are on genetic data, and with there was a case a few years ago of a criminal who was caught because their relatives were in a private genetic database. It was either Ancestry DNA or 2013. And
So your question was genetic testing of criminals.
yeah, so basically information by proxy. So if your relative is in a genetic database,
Yeah.
then your genetic information is also in that database, or at least some of it is. And there was a case where a criminal was caught because the police got some of the DNA, submitted it to this company, they got a match as, oh, you've got a relative nearby. They contacted the relative and said, hey, did one of your relatives own a gun and was in this area from this time, and they caught the criminal that way. I think it's good that people are solving crimes, but I'm concerned about how that information is being used.
I agree with you. And it reminds me of the early days of the charter where people were getting off because the police hadn't followed proper procedure. And I think that, no, I think it's going to bring to light a whole bunch of human rights issues. But yeah, I do think it's real legitimate use of your DNA. The problem is with this stuff is that there are always exceptions for law enforcement. And that's when they can pass the privacy legislation, so they can make an argument that it's for law enforcement.
Right. I guess the interesting part is that if your relative is part of one of these databases, it's their right to agree to those terms of service and have their information in there. But what's interesting is that because you're related to that person, some of your information is altered.
Well, that's where it gets scary. I haven't even thought about that actually. I saw the picture. I mean, I saw the story in the news, but I didn't actually think of the various levels of implication. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. But I don't have an answer to that. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. I don't know if I'm sure my coordinates are somewhere, but don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions on this, or if you just want to talk about sort of data protection and that, I mean, the whole area of the law as it relates to data protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you.